I did see a lot of people who were on varsity teams at school be able to say they had teammates and was recognized as being an athlete while a martial artist wasn't. And I missed out on all those things like having a jersey and having a team experience and the fun social stuff on the outside. So I was like, okay, I may as well just make one myself. So that's exactly what I did. In my PE masters, one of the things they would tell us when we were doing teacher training was that you actually want to be up to date with pop culture, to be honest. And you want to ask your students, what do you like? What do you watch? The biggest thing is that you're going to have a bad day, you're going to have good days, but you just have to keep going and stay consistent. That's how life is, and that's also how training is.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Tokushikai Inside Look podcast. Today we're speaking with Roche Sensei from New York City, USA. Roche Sensei has been training for over 16 years, during which time she has earned a record 6-time US national champion, helping the Greater New York Naginata team get first place 5 times and maintain a top 3 ranking in the country. She has represented the United States on the women's national team 3 times and achieved 2 silver medals. Roche Sensei is currently the youngest 5th dan outside of Japan and teaches at the Ken Zen Institute in New York City. As part of her research work at Columbia University, where she is also the head coach of the Naginata Club, she has pioneered an adapted curriculum for teaching Naginata to children with cerebral palsy. This was one of my favorite interviews since starting this podcast, providing a brief glimpse into Roche Sensei's drive and dedication to the art of Naginata. I feel very fortunate that there exists such an intelligent, resilient, and courageous young role model for the next generation of female budoka. So it's with my greatest pleasure to present to you, Roche Sensei.
My name is Roche. I'm from New York, and I started martial arts when I was the age of 6. I first had interest for it when I was 4 years old. I used to watch Kung Fu movies, basically all those Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee movies with my dad. My family also played a lot of fighting games in the household, so I would see martial arts everywhere. And I was pretty inspired by all the characters and all the game characters too, about how they can fight back, especially when, there was a bad guy there and they didn't have superpowers or anything crazy. They just had good skill and they were able to fight off injustice. And I wanted to do that too. The only thing is that I noticed that there was a lack of women characters in general. There were a lack of women heroines in all of these mediums back when I was growing up. So I wanted to change that. And initially I wanted to be a martial arts actress. I just wanted to be in martial arts movies and be a role model for girls like myself that want to get inspired to not get walked on all over the place and be able to fight back just as hard and just as strong. But I knew that I needed to have the actual training. And I also wanted to be an actual martial arts actress that went through hard training, because I learned growing up from my dad that a lot of those characters that appeared to maybe do a kick here and there, she wasn't an actual martial artist. She was just trained to do that particular action stunt for that particular thing. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to be an actual role model, somebody that did it. So I was interested in it. And then my parents found an after-school program at my elementary school. And I signed up for a jiu-jitsu program that was after school. But because it was after school, it was seasonal. And that's not how martial arts works. It's not a seasonal physical activity. It's, year-round and also a lifetime activity. So after that ended, the search was on again. And then my parents found a karate school and I was enrolled there. And over time, I guess your curiosity starts to develop and you start to see that there's other things out there. I first heard about Naginata through my maternal grandmother because she did Naginata in junior high school during World War II. And I was like, oh, what is that? I've never heard of that. That's interesting. And she just made this gesture of this long, object. I was 11 years old at the time. So this is years of karate, and I looked it up further, and my 11-year-old search engine skills on the internet wasn't that great. I was trying to find a dojo at the time and then couldn't find anything. Eventually, I said, oh, I guess it kind of looks something like kendo. I heard of kendo from my grandfather because back in World War II, the boys did kendo or judo, the girls did naginata. So my grandpa did kendo, but naginata looked the same, but it just had a long stick. And I was looking for a dojo and couldn't find one. Years later, I searched a little harder this time and I guess a little bit differently. So I was about a junior in high school going to my senior year, and I found a dojo, and then I just tried it out. I didn't think I would stay in it that long. I had different motivation back then than now, but I guess I just never got bored of it. And that's why I just kept doing it. And that's essentially how I started off the whole thing.
So I wanted to get into, as a young girl, you noticed in the movies that there was this lack of female action star in some ways, but you know that in movies it's not real fighting. Was it important to you that you chose a martial art that there was sparring, actual contact type thing, or were you just looking for something that was a martial art, like it was a true thing, discipline?
Cool question. Because as a 5-year-old, you just think it's all the same. And you think this is a martial art and that is it. And you just learn how to fight, you learn how to defend yourself, and you just become powerful. And that's all that gets in your head as a 5-year-old. Of course, I thought the sensible thing is like, oh, do kung fu, do karate, and found a karate dojo, and then I was in there. But that karate dojo, within, a short 2 years or so, I noticed even as a kid that something was off because there was no sparring there. It was all kata. And I thought that was a little bit strange, but I couldn't put words to it because I was a first or second grader, you know what I mean? So I thought something was wrong. I didn't know how to ask, but I just kept going with it because that's kind of what you do as a kid. You just sort of go with the flow. And then I started to realize maybe something was off, and it's no fault of them. I think that's just how their system was. It was like a traditional Okinawan style. And I think back in the days, it was all kata practically. And there wasn't anything standardized like a shiai or anything where it's actually fighting. They don't have it in the same standardized sort of method like they do now. I wanted something when I got older. So I guess during adolescence or going into middle school, that's when I was like, okay, I kind of want something a little more. My dojo actually had kobudo. So they actually had weapons there. And there was something intriguing about it. Even as a kid, I was like, wow, there's a weapon. And, you're taught in school that weapons are dangerous and only bad guys have it. Or, I guess I got tempted by the apple, the tree. But it was mysterious. And I saw that there were martial arts specializing in only in weapons. I was like, oh, that's really cool. And that's kind of how I started to look at other stuff. And even things like kendo or naginata, iaido, those arts started to come about, and I looked at it.
Ooh, when do you think your parents realized that this wasn't just a phase or some hobby that you were taking up and that you were serious about this? And when did you figure out that you were like that?
Well, my mother, first of all, she actually really despises Budo, which is funny. She's never done martial arts in her life, even though all my uncles and then my grandparents and everybody else did. But my father was more about that. I'm not really sure, really, but I think from what my father constantly told me when I was younger was that, see, I never forced you to go training. All those other parents of the kids, they force their kids to go, and the kids hate it, and that's why they quit. But you just wanted to go yourself. So I don't force you to train, you just go. But he also, I think everybody goes through those moments where you're like, oh, I don't want to go. You have a bad day. And that happens a lot with kids. And my dad would classically say this thing like, oh, so you want to quit? Okay, I'm just going to take your gi and I'm going to go burn it. And it's like a super dramatic thing. So then, of course, as a kid, you're like, oh, no, and then you have to go. So I think sometimes there's a little bit of that PTSD that I'm afraid that I'm going to find my gi in flames when I'm back at home. But I think my dad was the main catalyst in making this a thing. It was a way for me to get discipline, and discipline meaning you stay consistent no matter what. And I started to notice that as I got older, when you see a bunch of people go in and out of the dojo, like, they lack the consistency, they lack the discipline. And I just equated to discipline. And I had that at a young age. So I thank that for my dad. And I guess Budo itself. So I'm not really sure if it's sort of hard to answer what my parents thought, but I can definitely say that they used it definitely as a way to keep me disciplined mentally and be able to help control my temper and my emotions. And that's why they put me in martial arts. For myself, realizing this was just more than a hobby, it's very hard to say, honestly. And I think part of the reason is because I started as a young child. So I don't have that same sort of perspective as somebody who started older. As a child, it's like, this is like your thing 4 times a week, 7 times a week. You just go there. It's after school, go to practice, and then you come back home. It's just part of your daily thing. It's almost like eating another meal. So it's not like I really could say that I hate it nor I'm passionate about it. It just like was already just part of my daily routine. And it just feels weird without it. It's kind of how it is.
So high school comes along, you started Naginata, and usually we see a lot of very enthusiastic kids, but when university comes, that's a turning point. And some make it through, very few make it through, some do. What do you attribute your ability to stay with it despite all these added responsibilities now that you're going away to university?
Things I grew up with a lot was a saying that if you don't like something, do something about it. And that always stuck with me throughout my life. And I think one thing is that I never was a team sports player. I really just found them all to be dumb because there's no strategy in the same way as if you're fighting one-on-one with someone. You know, there's way more variabilities and potential variabilities from fighting another person versus another team where everything is architected by one person. It just wasn't, I thought it was more interesting. And I think because of that, I did see a lot of people who were on varsity teams at school be able to say they had teammates and was recognized as being an athlete while a martial artist wasn't. It's sort of viewed as this alternative medicine to physical activity. You know what I mean? And it doesn't have the same weight. But I missed out on all those things, like having a jersey and having a team experience and the fun social stuff on the outside and actually hanging out with people that are around my age. That's something I lacked. And I had a senpai, I did kendo a little bit, and he said that, oh yeah, well, a college club is a great place because if you don't have it, you could just start it there. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll just do that. I never had the varsity team experience, so I may as well just make one myself. So that's exactly what I did. Essentially, I went to undergrad. I went to Mount Holyoke College, and it was an all-women's college. It's the oldest of the seven sisters. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the school, but I went there, and they're very big on pioneering women. And so I thought it was just perfect. And they were very supportive. They weren't bureaucratic in the same way as I've experienced with other universities. And I've heard other people saying about big schools, where they're more bureaucratic, way more hoops to go through. Mount Holyoke was very supportive, and they were like, yeah, okay, start your own club, but just be aware of the practical sense. And I learned it throughout the way. So that's what I did. I just started my own club. Starting it is difficult in that every school practically has a minimum member requirement. So usually 10, you know, and I'm like, well, isn't this like a chicken and egg situation where you don't, you know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense. But basically, everybody knows what really goes on in that you just get signatures of people just petition for it and then you're good. So I learned a lot of that, and basically had a friend do that, had somebody look at the poster, was personable with everybody, and slowly but surely it became a thing. And so that's how I was able to keep up with it, because I saw how some of my other dojo mates and other senpai were when they were in high school. They did martial arts as their consistent thing after school. They go off to college far away, and there's no school, there's no dojo, there's no club. They don't try to start one because they don't have that kind of ambition. And they come back and they're very rusty. And I was like, I don't want to be like that. So that's why. And I thought that as long as I'm moving at least like once a week, those 4 months, at least I didn't lose a lot of that stuff and I won't be rusty. And so that's kind of how I kept up with it.
By this time, were you already involved with competition in Naginata, or did that come later?
Yes, I was already involved. There weren't that many opportunities for competition in Naginata because it is a small kind of environment, small community. But my sensei was a very competitive, aggressive, ambitious person. And so she immediately put me in competition at an early age, practically immediately.
Okay, could you talk a little bit about your sensei and what were the first several years like with her? What was she like?
So she was from Japan and she got married to an American and settled here. But she was basically a very good sensei. She was probably the best sensei I've had, to be honest. What was special about her was that she knew how to win and she knew how to teach others how to win. And that's really rare. It's usually either one or the other, you know, but she could do both. She also was a very good strategist, combat strategist. She could read opponents very well. She could read potential. So she could see what everyone's individual talents are, but also their weaknesses. She was very good with all of that. And she also had more than one trick in the hat, I guess I'd like to say, for teaching somebody. If they don't get it through one explanation, she had another one as a backup. But she had a very bad temper. It's funny because when, she passed away about 8 years ago, actually, from a brain aneurysm. She was only 52. When people ask me what my sensei was like, I tell them she was just like Bobby Knight. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bobby Knight, but Bobby Knight was that basketball coach for Indiana back in the 90s, and he has gotten ejected from tournaments because he threw a chair across the court. He was scary and he yelled at everybody. My sensei was like him, but she was a 5'2", very skinny Japanese female version of Bobby Knight. But she was like that. She would just yell, and she was very good at what she did. If you look past that, she was a very, very good sensei, honestly. So when I first met her, I was 16 and a high schooler, and I'm used to a certain type of personality as a martial arts sensei. Usually it's one that's kind of like a Yoda figure, sort of calm and wise and observant. But she was just yelling at everybody. And then I was like, wow, I can't believe this. I'm seeing a sensei who actually loses their temper. That's so interesting. I've never seen one before. I wasn't scared. I was just kind of taken aback that somebody like this outlier exists. And the first few practices, she was very hard on me, and she was just like, this is wrong, this is wrong. And my senpai were also kind of like that, like, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong. But I don't know, I didn't let it get to me. I just kind of kept going. But then within the first day of meeting her, she was already planning out the next World Championships. And she was like, okay, yeah, you're going to be in the next World Championships. And I was like, what? And to me, that was the most bizarre idea, because I just started, and I'm thinking of like, if you're going to the World Championships, you're an Olympian where you've trained since you were 3 years old for 90 hours a day and really, really good. And I was like, I don't have that kind of experience on my back, but she said that, and I was like, okay, well, fine. I trust you know what you're doing, so I'll just do it if you think it's possible. And that's what it was like.
Wow, so she already had this long-term plan out there. And then how did you go from a beginner to part of the national team? What was her process? What did you have to go through?
I mean, she was a very good strategist, and she was a good sensei, so she could see people's potential. But she was also, part of it also is being good at seeing what your competition was and what your likeliness was. So for some reason, I guess she thought it was fine. But it's sort of hard to say, because I was also the only female student, oddly enough, even though Naginata has a tradition of being mainly women doing it. It's hard for me to know, because it's not like I had other females around my age starting from the same time period to compare to see if she trained me any differently than anybody else. But it was just consistent training, and she did a lot of kata training on me. Because I had a kendo background, I don't know, she didn't put me in bogu quickly. She waited for a little while, but she got me testing fast. I don't know if it's because she wanted me on the national team, or she literally thought that I just had the ability already because of my previous martial arts experience, and the knowledge transfer was beneficial. But I trained, and that was it, and just stayed consistent and just did what she said. I guess it's simple in that regard. You just do what the sensei says.
I heard that unique to Naginata in that there's the kata practice and the sparring, and they actually work together quite a bit. It's not like one is over more important than the other one. They are integrated in that way. Could you explain a little bit more about how that works in Naginata in terms of kata and then how it's used in competition?
Compare Naginata to other martial arts and why Naginata has an equal emphasis on kata and sparring. I think the answer to that can simply go down to this whole debate in education about whether or not a lot of curricula are focused around test taking performance versus learning. And I think in the case of a lot of martial arts, it is revolved more around test taking and performance. So that affects the curriculum. How that is with Naginata, I think, is that the reason why I think there's an equal emphasis on both is because there are competitions for both. If there was no kata competition and it was only bogu, for example, I don't think we would be practicing kata as much because it doesn't make sense. The outcome is really just, okay, what? I mean, it's already been proven in plenty of motor learning research, which is my specialty, that if you want to do something or you want to learn something like a motor skill, you have to just practice that particular thing over and over and over again with this desired environment. So if you take that into consideration, I think that it doesn't make sense to do kata if the performance moment is going to be all bogu, right? If it's only bogu. Because there are two types of competition, I think that's why there's an equal emphasis on both, 50-50.
Oh, so now you mentioned this thing on motor learning research. Mm-hmm. Martial artists, usually it's a very practical thing. People practice it and then use it and do it. But then this kind of scientific theory behind how the body works and how the body learns is something that we lack a little bit of, and I think we can gain a lot from it. So maybe you could tell us a bit about, first, what is motor learning research, and then what have you picked up from that has helped you either do or teach Naginata or any other martial art, you think?
Well, I think I'm also an even rarer case of that population because I have one master's degree in physical education, and I'm also a physical education teacher, which is very common with Naginata players in Japan. And I think a lot of kendo players or judo senseis too, like they're PE teachers or they have a PE degree. So I have a physical education degree, I teach it, and then I also have a motor learning degree. So I'm a master's in that, both from Columbia. But motor learning in particular is, in a nutshell, it's neuroscience with the focus in how you learn movement. So neuroscience and kinesiology put together. And the research has evolved immensely over time. The older research in the 90s, for example, they had, to me, I found more interesting where they were actually researching expert performance, and versus novice practitioners of a particular physical activity, or musicians, for example, because there's a lot of movement in music too. And there's a lot of things about learning and how many repetitions it takes. That's from motor learning research. And what the definition of an expert is. There's two, and there's different ways that your brain works where you can learn a motor skill in particular. In the recent years, so 10 years or so, the field has started to take a change, and now it's more focused on rehabilitation. The research now is mainly on individuals with a movement disorder. So, for example, cerebral palsy, post-stroke patients, Huntington's disease, and they try to find ways to best help them. A lot of occupational therapists also have to use a lot of the research in motor learning to help them when they're actually treating patients. And so as far as to what I've been learning, what I've taken from motor learning, there's a new theory called the optimal theory, which is where if you use explicit attention or explicit direction, an external focus of attention, versus internal focus of attention when you're trying to tell somebody to do a move. External, if you tell them to focus on something that's external, so that's outside the body. I'll give examples in a minute. But if you use external focus of attention, then there is a higher chance of the person learning the skill quicker, more efficiently, basically better speed in general. And an example of explicit, or I guess external focus of attention is if I were to give you a cue, I would say, okay, focus on gripping the naginata as hard as you can and pulling it down. Like focus on gripping the handles of the ebu, which is the shaft of the naginata. Focus on gripping the handles of the naginata when you're swinging down in men. That's external because I'm telling you, focus on the feel of the naginata itself. If I were doing internal, I would say, focus on moving your arm down. What the optimal theory proposes is that if you're putting your focus on something that's outside your body, which is external, that actually helps you learn a move quicker, like a technique quicker. And it also is most often than not what we would call the correct one, which is that you're able to create efficient movement faster with less repetitions compared to if you gave the person the internal focus of attention, which is something in their body, it takes them longer to figure it out. So that's something I carried over.
That makes a lot of sense for a weapon art. How does that work for running or for something where there's no object? I want to understand, what does it mean by external, internal? What would you focus on?
Like for running, you can focus on the hardness of the ground when you're going. So there's something there that's external. So you just have to make that the cue. Or you could focus on the trees in the distance. That's not quite the external focus of attention because you're not directly touching it in the same way as if you're focusing on the feel of the ground when you're running. But that's a similar concept. Instead of saying focus on bringing your knees up as high as you can, that's internal because you're trying to control something in your body, but you really don't feel that. You know what I mean?
This is super interesting. I want to kind of give a couple examples and then maybe you can help me figure out what would be a way to teach this. So in general, we sometimes in martial arts, we'll start with footwork. So we'll say, make sure that you're walking a certain way. In that case, I think you said that like in running, you would feel the ground. So the focus would be the floor.
I teach footwork. I tell, because Naginata's footwork also is very specific. It's all sliding. And I tell all of my students, like, you want to feel the floor the whole time. You want to feel the smoothness of the wood with the balls of your feet. Like, you want to feel the smoothness of the wood. Focus on the feel of the smoothness of the floor. That usually gets them to do it quickly. Compared to if I say, okay, focus on like turning your hip all the way. It doesn't really do that. One thing I do in Naginata, for example, is, the big thing with Naginata is that there's a lot of hip rotation. That's how it's like practically 95% hip rotation in a lot of this stuff. And you have to learn how to move your body. The hanmi is different in Naginata versus, I guess, a sword art. And what I tell my students to do is, okay, you're going to focus on trying to get your body to turn and completely face the wall behind you. You're going to go one wall, another wall, one wall, another wall. So they're looking at they're trying to focus on the walls, and usually their body just goes with it. So I do that too. But the floor has been the most effective.
Okay. So along this line, we were talking about these other things that you are able to incorporate into your practice or how you teach. You mentioned that you got created this adapted curriculum for Naginata. Could you tell us about that?
When I was trying to look into doctoral programs, so I'm still in the process of applying right now, but I talked with one of the advisors at Columbia that's in the same department as I was, because I was finishing up my physical education master's, and then I wanted to do a doctorate, but then I was like, I really like the motor learning. I'm not into physical education as much as a doctorate. I like the stuff in motor learning better. And so I talked with him, and he suggested at first go the master's route, which I totally understand because it's very research-based. And he suggested, why don't you just try to teach Naginatas to cerebral palsy children? And, at first I was just like, this isn't really my interest, because I'm more interested in elite athletes and trying to get people at national team level, international team level. But I said, you know what? Okay, why don't I give this a try? The biggest catalyst in having me do it was that I remember in one of my motor control class, so it's the same thing, but in my motor control class, my professor said there that the neuromotor processes, so the way that your brain creates new wires, the axons and stuff, If, for example, are a post-stroke patient and you need to learn how to walk again, the way that your brain works in making the new connections is exactly the same as learning. It's exactly the same. So at first, when I tell this to people, they're like, huh? But then they take a few seconds and they're like, oh, wait, it does make sense, because if you can't walk anymore after a stroke, you probably had a lesion in that connection. And then it is learning it all over again. So you need to make a new wire. It makes total sense. So then I thought about that. I said, okay, you know what? I'll give this a shot with CP. And Columbia has a cerebral palsy research camp. And so they have a lot of children with cerebral palsy come in, and they give them like 9 hours of intense occupational therapy and physical therapy to try to get them to get better quality of movement. And one of the activities I did was Naginata. So I taught Naginata one-on-one to this 11-year-old kid. And he was hemiplegic. So he looked like any other typically developing kid. But then I was like, really? This kid's? But then when he walked closer, I realized his hand was kind of up. So that's where the impairment was. And he couldn't even touch his ring finger to his thumb or his pinky with that one hand. And I was like, all right, well, let me just see what I could do. So I figured out a way to do it. And the one thing when you're trying to do adapted anything is that you have to prioritize movement, so getting them to move over precision. And I know that's so difficult for anybody doing like a perfectionist martial art like Naginata, Iaido, or anything where it's like 99.9% technique. It is very, very hard to do. But as a teacher, you have to know when to let that go and figure out what's important. So I just worked on getting them to do it, get the balance good, because a lot of CP children have some balance issues. I worked on it and increased the difficulty. Then I put Bogu on, and then I had him hit Sune, and it was fun. Then more kids wanted to do it, and it's because they're looking, they're like, what, you get to hit people? Okay, I want to do this. But then all these kids, like some kids are diplegic, which if you're not familiar with it, they're paralyzed from hip below. So it's like, oh man, okay, I got to think of something, because if Naginata is all hip turn, what am I going to do? Is this even feasible? But I figured out a way to do it. It's so modified because for more impaired children, but they're still doing something. And the main thing with them is being able to have them hit the target. Okay, so that's, if you give them the target, then they're good. Their motivation goes up. And of course, having them be goal-oriented, which is what my sensei taught me, have them learn the spiritual side, being calm, stuff that yoga teaches. You teach them all of that, but you just have to really adapt, and you have to be willing to let go of some of the precision and perfection of the techniques, depending on the ability of the child. And with all my experiences, I was able to develop something like that and took notes. And now I have this adapted curriculum for cerebral palsy kids. And then I plan to try to get a cerebral palsy only class, but I need to get some occupational therapists to be in the dojo, preferably students, because I need somebody to spot the child in case they go off balance. But that's something that's definitely in my goal field, and it was due to the inspiration from my advisor.
Wow, that's amazing. And it probably is a great thing for those kids too, because not only do they get to try something fun and different, but they get to tell their friends about it, tell their family about it, that they're doing some kind of martial art even in their condition. So that's amazing that you're doing this.
Yeah.
So we talked a bit about how you're teaching in your dojo. We talked about this group. The reason I was connected with you was through Daria from Russia. Could you talk a bit about going into the international scene for Naginata, international community, and what you've gained from that, and what have you been able to give back to that community?
The one thing that was nice, that I really liked about Naginata, and having my sensei be from Japan and a recent immigrant. She's not really an immigrant because she never naturalized, but basically the fact that it wasn't too long ago since she left Japan, I like that, because she still had her connections to Japan and was able to get me into dojos and train there with other people and develop my Naginata more. I like that, and I did not have that at a lot of my other dojos. And I think that because Naginata is small everywhere, it's very easy to get to know everyone, especially the international route. If you're competing internationally, it is only natural that you meet international people and everybody knows each other. And basically, that's what happens. You're in like the same Facebook groups and you see each other in tournaments. Everyone stalks each other's videos because everybody's competitive in a small pool. And it's small, so everyone knows each other. So at the same time, sort of like, okay, yeah, then I don't think it's a big deal to just say hi because I know who you are, you know who I am. And it just kind of was like that with the international scene. With Daria in particular, it was very interesting because she just joined that Naginata group and that Facebook group. And then she asked if there was Naginata in Russia. And it was a very strange, I feel like it was like, it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, I definitely think there's those weird coincidences in life that science can't explain through the formal scientific method. But that was one of them. Because when she wrote that, literally, it was 1 week before I knew one of my students at Columbia was going to Russia for this trip that Columbia arranged. And I was like, are you serious? Wait, and you're going in the same town? So then I messaged her and I was like, okay, well, I have a student. He is a beginner. He just started, but maybe he could go there and we could try it out there. And then they connected and then he did it and it was good. And then it just started from there. And Daria also was able to get a connection with Sumi Sensei. So Sumi Masatake is a Kendo Hachidan. His wife is a Naginata Hanshi. She's also a Sumi Sensei. So she met her at, I think, like a Budo demonstration in Europe where Sumi husband, Sumi hubby, and Sumi wifey were both there. And she invited her to Russia. And I was like, okay, I want to actually train with a Hanshi. Let's do this. And then because it was Russia, I knew no one was going to go because it's like, a new developing thing. And people always have this kind of judgment, like, oh, if it's like a small developing group, it's not worth going because nobody's going. But I think the opposite. I'm like, oh, this is a great opportunity to get more individualized attention. So I'm going. Plus, the good thing about Naginata with the international scene is that it gives me an excuse to travel, and it's not to just like go and do this pointless thing of taking very vain Instagram selfies on famous monuments or anything like that and to show off. I actually go for a purpose. I get to see new things. I get to also train. So I like killing two birds with one stone, and I was able to do that in the international community. And with Daria going to Russia, I was like, okay, whatever. I've never seen Russia. Let's go. And I wanted to do it. So that's what happened. I always kept in contact with her.
Okay, so let's talk about some of your competitions, some of the times you've represented the national team. I imagine that every single time you go, it's a little bit different. You might face different opponents. You have a little more experience, or when your first time, it might be a little daunting. Maybe you could talk about how that's developed over the years. What was your first one like, and then the next one, and to the most recent?
In the first one, I think I always like a first experience and everything, and a first Taikai, because everything is new. So you're absorbing and learning everything that's around you. I just get less nervous about it because I'm just taking in everything around me. So it was just more interesting. But I guess one of the shocking things in my first one was, why aren't my points counting? And I was like so used to doing like the same move and having it count and getting points easier. But then for some reason, I didn't get them count as much. But I think I forgot my point. I think my first ippon at the World Championships was extremely rare and probably extremely unusual for that being a first point ever. And that was my first one. It just was there and I just did it. And I think that I did feel as though that I didn't get adequate training beforehand. And I was kind of frustrated at my sensei for that because she basically didn't really put her bogu on. And then I think she didn't put her bogu on a lot of times due to health reasons, to be honest. That's like a separate issue. But I just was a bit frustrated and I felt like I could have been more prepared, and I thought there would be a more physical component to training for the World Championships. Like I would be getting a resistance training plan or forced to run, but didn't do any of that. But it is what it is. So I just did it. And that was about it. Like, just go in. And then the second time I went, it was the same thing. And, to be honest, the biggest turnoff about being in something like the World Championships is that a lot of times I feel like you don't get rewarded for your hard work and you can't do anything about it. But I think from my recent World Championships, because I already saw that twice and had to train on my own and figure it out on my own, then I was more prepared for it and I was more jaded at that point. So I just knew how to do it. But I just still, of course, was sort of like, this is just not appropriate, but there's nothing I can do about it. So I got to do the best I can. And that's essentially it. A lot of times, especially since my sensei did pass away 8 years ago, you have to go outside of your realm of expertise and try to, for example, cross-train or get ideas from other martial arts. I mean, Iaido probably also has a lot of common philosophical things with Naginata. There are a lot of common things that we can find. It's just that the application of it may be slightly different because the conditions are different. But I had to do that a lot and get ideas. That's part of the reason why I went into physical education and motor learning, is to try to find answers that I couldn't find because my sensei died, and then, even though your sensei kid doesn't tell you everything, you just have to wait for like the moment for you to be ready to learn whatever concept it is. And I just did that. So I knew what to do. So that's kind of what it was like. I just had to train on my own. The different thing that I think this round of World Championships was that I decided to actually try to be a team player, which, is like really weird. I was always selected for the team, but I think everybody said I'm more of an individual player. I don't really know. It's just sometimes other people know you better than you know yourself. But regardless, I was always selected for the team. And this time there were other teammates who were also young. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to just bite the bullet and I'm going to just go and try to do some team icebreakers. And we're still now very good friends till this day, actually. And that was a major difference. So every single time I try to do something differently. And this time, the most rewarding thing was having teammates that actually are friends, which is something I wanted since I was younger.
Oh, that's cool. Was there anything in particular that you might want to share? One, with people that might be listening to you who know Naginata that might not hear something on a regular basis that you think would be interesting to know, or to non-Naginata practitioners, and how you see that art growing in lockstep with all these other ones like Iaido and Kyudo that are not like the popular ones like Karate and Judo.
This is just like a little takeaway message, right? Like just what to take from the whole thing. I mean, at this point in my life, what would I say to everybody? I think that Naginata is a great martial art in that there's so many different techniques and you can actually apply them. There aren't restrictions to it when you are in Shiai. That makes it interesting. You can use Koryu, so old Naginata techniques. You could apply it in Shiai if you want. It doesn't matter. You could do it. And a lot of other combat martial arts, they have restrictions on what techniques you can and cannot use. But Naginata doesn't really do that to the same scrutiny. I think that's one of the cool things about it. What I would say about it, I think that Naginata, I guess, was something that unexpectedly came in my life. And I didn't think I would get this far in it. And it's been a source of a lot of intense pain and intense moments of joy that one can't even imagine. And I think that the biggest thing is that you're going to have a bad day, you're going to have good days, but you just have to keep going and stay consistent. That's how life is, and that's also how training is. Always try to improve your character. It's okay, and I think normal for you to make mistakes and to also sometimes go to the dark side. That happens to everybody, even the good characters in all those fictional stories. But learn from it. It doesn't become a part of you unless you allow it to continue to be a part of you. You can learn from it and be wise and guide others, but just do the right thing. And most importantly, stay consistent, because otherwise you're going to find your gi in flames in your house. And I guess that's what I would have to say.
Awesome. That's a great way to pull it back to the beginning, that whole part. Well, thank you so much for taking this time and talking to us and sharing your stories. I did want to ask something that felt like such a cool ending, but I did want to ask something else. So you're really young for being at this level in the martial arts. You might see it a lot more in Japan where they do start as kids. One of the things that I've seen when you are this age is that you want to get more younger people into it. So how do you think about that? And what do you try to do to encourage more young people to get involved?
I think it's just hard, but I think the common thing is you always try. Well, in my PE masters, one of the things they would tell us when we were doing teacher training was that you actually want to be up to date with pop culture, to be honest. And you want to ask your students, what do you like? What do you watch? Because first of all, that opens the door, and then the students think, oh my God, this teacher's actually pretty cool. They like the same things. They know what I'm talking about. Then you got the first level of trust through. Then if you're trying to teach something and you use examples from pop culture things, I guess one example, I don't watch this show, but I have a lot of friends who watch it. So I know, I guess, a little bit about it, is Game of Thrones, right? So I think, for example, if I'm explaining how somebody is like in Naginata, for example, and sort of what not to be like, I'm like, okay, you don't want to be a Joffrey. Okay, so then people will be like, oh yeah, no, we don't want to be like that and stuff. And I'm like, okay, but you also, you give examples from there, and then people understand it better because a lot of learning is intuitive. But if younger people know that you like the same things as them, they definitely will want to come. And obviously, the way that you motivate young kids, like elementary school kids versus middle school, high school, college, and 20s, it's very different. And I think it gets a little complicated from that degree. With really young kids, like elementary levels, I just put Pokemon in my kids' class. And then I always do a game at the end of my classes that helps them with Naginata footwork or something. But they like the Pokemon and the silly stuff. And the older kids, a lot of times the older ones, if they're doing something like Budo, they probably have played a lot of video games or, that's really the main thing. Video games or anime. And if you mention it, that's enough to get them sort of being like, oh yeah, okay, so this is cool. That's kind of what I would do. But I think a lot of it also just depends on the teacher. There are disadvantages to being young or young looking, and also disadvantages of being a young female that's Asian versus a young male that's Asian or a young male that is non-Asian. There's just differences. There's disadvantages. One thing which I experience is that people just see me on the street and they don't believe it that I'm a martial artist or a Godan and 6-time champion, whatever, right? Like they don't believe it. Like they're just like, you just look like an Instagram influencer, or you look like somebody who's vegan and does yoga and stuff. But I'm not. They just judge me based on appearance. And that is something I also want to change, because I think the idea of femininity and masculinity it's set in martial arts, and I kind of want to change that and bend it so people can see that there's more to that. And Naginata was one of the few, probably the only martial art that I saw that was encouraging to the feminine kind of qualities. And there are the people that just look at me, they're like, you're just a sensei, who's going to take you seriously? Especially since everything I own is pink. But I just don't care. And you really can't care. And it takes a lot to have the strength to be like, I don't care, and be able to project that in a diplomatic way as well. But people just get turned off from it. They want to learn from a Yoda kind of sensei, or, a Japanese sensei from Japan. However, I used my appearance or whatnot to recruit like-minded people who otherwise get intimidated going into a male-dominated martial art. And so I do that. I just make it welcoming. It's also the way you project your language too. If you're just like, oh my God, then you're going to recruit other people that are like, oh my God, seriously, you're going to probably recruit people like that. But if you're talking more formal and proper, you may recruit people that prefer the more formal, proper style. It just depends on how you like to project yourself. I try to use what I have to my advantage. I know not everybody will like it, but that's fine. You can't please everybody. So it's more stressful to try to do that. So it's best to just be yourself, and you'll get the right people. If it happens to be young, it's young. Just take that. I just welcome anybody who wants to learn something as esoteric as Naginata.
Wow, that's great. Well, thank you so much for doing all this to help promote this traditional martial art. I thought that from the jump, as soon as you started speaking, that there was a lot of weight, there was a lot of dedication, a lot of thinking behind this. So you can get past the looks very quickly as soon as you start talking. So I was very impressed by that. I'm very impressed with your self-awareness at a young age as well, and being aware that there are pains and challenges along the way, and there'll probably be many more in the future as well, but you're facing it head on. So thanks for being strong. Thanks for being strong for the next generation. And I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I hope she grows up with the same type of strength as you do. So thank you so much.
Welcome to do my kids' class if she's in New York. So,
well, we come down every year for the East Coast Iaido Taikai. Yeah, and yes, Gordon's been trying to convince us. He says he has a spare bogu from Olivia to give to our daughter. So we'll see. My daughter started kendo. Yeah, and maybe next time we're down in the States in New York, she could try it out.
Olivia, I'll do a quick story, is that talking about the whole thing of a female sensei, right? The advantages. So Olivia, if you're going to put this, I don't know if you're going to put this on the podcast, but like Olivia is like 7 years old. She has long hair. Okay, so everybody in Naginata in Japan, you basically wear a bun because everybody has long hair practically, or very short hair, but you wear your hair in a bun. Olivia has long hair and it's in a ponytail, and it was like getting loose all the time. And then I was like, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put your hair in a bun. So I get out my magical long elastic, and it's just specific for girls with long hair. You want to keep it up. I said, okay, Olivia, I'm going to do your hair. So I did her hair in a ponytail, and then I did a bun. I got that magic elastic and I did it. And she's like, oh yeah, this is how I did it for dance class. That's great. And then it never came off. And then Gordon messaged me. He's like, oh, thank you so much. It's so great to have a female sensei because they understand hair problems. And like, so it's kind of funny. And I was like, okay, yes, I love that aspect of having a female sensei because I did not have that growing up. And my sensei was female, and she definitely helped with a lot of those female things. So I'm glad I could help that with a young one too.
Cool. All right. So speaking of daughters, I need to give my daughter a bath. So hope to meet you again in the future.
Oh, thank you so much again. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Have a good night.
Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is available on most common podcasting platforms and on YouTube. Remember to subscribe to not miss out on new interviews as they are posted. We're always looking for feedback to improve, so please write us a review or drop us a line at podcast@tokushikai.ca or on Facebook and Instagram at tokushikai.canada. Until next time, thanks for listening.